All right, let's begin with our second look at Mr. William Wordsworth, and we last class looked at his lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, which was a poem that he wrote in the Lyrical Ballads, which I spoke about last class, which is a collection of poems he wrote along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which launched the Romantic movement in England. And I think we concluded with not the whole of the poem, but the part of the poem where he the theological claims of Romanticism are asserted. Really, it's not here. It's that's the poem we're going to look at today, the Immortality Ode. But in Tintern Abbey, he in lines, let's see here, 95, 96 and onwards, he talks about this sense sublime of thoughts, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So he, at that point, is connecting his mind with the world around him, and in fact saying that really thought and object are not that, although they might be distinct, are still in some sense equal. And I said that this marked panentheism, I think, is the claim here, that there's a sort of a spiritual equivalence between the world around us and human nature. That's part of what's being said there. Now, the apparently positive side of that is that he's seeing that there's a spiritual significance to all things. So it's not just as the materialists of the 18th century saw it, it's not a dead world like a mechanical thing. It is actually life, and it has spiritual significance. So that is clearly an improvement on probably the way the 18th century saw it, and Jonathan Swift observed it, that people are doing terrible things to other human beings and not seeing them as spiritual beings. So he's, in a sense, elevating our esteem for the natural world. But he does so, and this is the effect of it, however, he does so by diminishing human nature. That's the thing. And C.S. Lewis observes that whenever people tend to exalt things and lift them up the chain of being, we saw this actually in Paradise Lost, the ultimate effect is that humanity gets its face pushed down into the muck. You can give a chimp human rights or your dog human rights. He's not going to exercise them. All you've done is draw an equivalence between us and animals and thereby reduced us to animals. So that's the real effect of this. And I don't think that's the intended effect. The intended effect of Wordsworth's writing is to see the spiritual significance of all things. And I think he's very good at that, in fact. And there's a genuine power in Wordsworth's poetry, which I have always keenly felt, and which made him, I might add, one of C.S. Lewis's favorite poets. If you like C.S. Lewis, he esteemed Wordsworth very highly. One of his 5 favorite writers, I do believe. And the next poem we're going to look at today, which is the Intimations Ode, so-called. It's an ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. First of all, it's written in the form of an ode. Let me just say a little bit about that. The ode is a literary form. It's an ancient literary form. It goes back to the Greek writers. Theocritus wrote in odes. So did Pindar. Theocritus and Pindar. So did Sappho, for that matter. But these, and they tend to be written around contemplative subjects. Now, Pindar writes the Olympian odes. He's writing about Olympic Games and so forth. But by the time we come to this period, the ode is, first of all, ode means a song. So just like lyrical ballads are a type of song, so an ode is also a type of song. But the ode as a form is now more strongly associated than anything else with the sublime. This word sublime again, which we're going to come to identify more strongly. Now, last class I talked about the sublime in the ruin of Tintern Abbey, and he writes upon the abbey as a ruin, and yet it's not the abbey itself, it's his memory of the abbey. It's the imaginative filling of the gaps in the thing that he sees that is the real significance. So in other words, it's the spiritual significance of the physical object, which is talking about something you can't see, and yet he says is in some ways more real and more important than the physical thing that you can see. It talks about the power of the imagination, and Wordsworth is a poet of the imagination, if nothing else. Well, this ode is likewise written on a subject of the sublime, because odes in this period are. And Wordsworth's not the only poet to write odes in this period. John Keats will write many odes, in fact, and be famous for writing on them. And we'll come to Keats in a few classes. But this one is subtitles, and it's from Recollections of Early Childhood. So again, it's memories. Now he's talking about the importance of memory in the development of a person's sense of self. So how do we become who we are? How do we know ourselves? How do we come to know ourselves? Wordsworth is going to identify his sense of himself very strongly with his memories of himself, which you may say, how could it be otherwise? But the important thing to note on this is that the memory here is something that is his own thing. It's not things that he's not relying on books. He's not relying on authorities. He's not relying on views of human nature or the world that have been taught to him by the church or by the schools. It's a self-reliant thing. And that's the key point here. And so his memory is giving him a foundation for his later sense of self. And he's going to posit great significance to his early childhood and say that, in fact, it is so significant that the early childhood experiences make him the man that he is as an adult. Not his religious convictions, not his national identity, not his scientific or other expertise that he derives as an adult, but the childhood experiences are what form him to be the man that he is now. Now that may not sound odd to you, but historically it's extraordinary. It's literally revolutionary. These claims were not made before this period. Yes?
So is William Wordsworth kind of an early person in psychology, or does this just correlate with when psychology started?
I think psychology flows out of the turn of the Romantics and the emphasis on the self. Remember, I don't know if I mentioned this in class or not. I'm sometimes wonder where I said what. But psychology as a discipline is, of course, the science of the psyche. But what the psyche is, I did say it in this class. What is the psyche? Mm-hmm. What exactly is this thing that the science of psychology explores? And I asked it actually as a rhetorical question, in part because you could give me an answer, but it would be one answer, and there are multiple answers to it. So there are various schools of psychology, and they actually differ profoundly on what this thing called the psyche is. On the one hand, you get the materialists that'll say the psyche is the brain. That's becoming more and more common in our day. So the psyche, that immaterial thing, is actually a material thing. And from that we get brain chemistry and so forth. I actually lived when I was over at the University of Durham with a psychology PhD student, and she was looking at the influence of serotonin on people's attitudes, of behaviors, and so forth. So she was injecting serotonin into lab rats and all that. I don't know exactly what the thing was. But that very much looking at the brain in relation to people and using lab rats for that purpose. So that's the one side of psychology, who think it's the brain. Then there are others, though, that think it's the immaterial object, in which case it's more like the mind. It's the thinking thing within us. And that thinking thing seems to be able to regard us from the outside. So we can think about ourselves, for instance. Like when you think about yourself, are you really thinking about yourself, or are you, like, what's going on there? Is this just a biochemical, charade, and you think that you're thinking when you're not really? I mean, I don't think that anyone genuinely concludes that, but if you're a real materialist, you are more or less in that position, in which case you think that thinking is what I said last time is called epiphenomenology. It's the illusion that I am thinking when really it's just my genes or the chemical impulses making me feel like I'm thinking. But Wordsworth, and so you rightly point out that psychology to some degree is dependent on this idea of being able to get back to our own essential self, namely our psyche, by ourselves. And they simply use scientific methods of empirical science to test who I am by myself. I wrote a book not on this subject alone, but on the problem of the methodology, which is that the subject is trying to see himself as the object. So I'm on this side of the magnifying glass, and I'm looking at myself on that side. So I'm the subject and the object at one and the same time, and I'm claiming objectivity. It's impossible. It's literally an impossibility. You can't really claim that this has objectivity. And nowadays, everyone acknowledges the importance of bias, or the impossibility of avoiding bias or prejudice. But when Wordsworth writes this, he is, I think, quite naive about this, and thinks that in his early experience in the presence of nature, he becomes the man who he is. And now he represents it in this little epigram, which is right at the outset, quite a famous one, and he's quoting himself, which is not very humble. Let me think of a famous way of putting this. Oh yes, I wrote, "The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." It's very enigmatic. The child is father of the man. It's a little bit like the chicken-egg scenario, right? In one sense, it's true. The child is the father of the man in the sense that you're a child before you become a man. When I say this, I mean it in a generic sense and not in the male sense. When I become an adult as opposed to the child is the father in the sense that he precedes it. But he's saying a little bit more than that, and it's that aspect of which is saying more that I want to address right now. It's the idea that the child is actually the teacher of the adult. That is the position, the very radical position that Wordsworth is advancing in this poem. And he will do it through various poetic devices and through allusions and through memories. But that is what he's advancing. And so it's a revolution if you think of education. Normally you think of teachers as adults, and what are they doing? They're teaching children to learn about the world and how to behave, etc. And they do so primarily, as we've seen from the beginning of the course, they do it through imitation. Remember back in the first semester when we looked at the Odyssey, there was this figure called Mentor who taught Odysseus how to behave. Remember, taught Telemachus. Telemachus grew up without a father. His father, Odysseus, was over in the wars in Troy, and he hadn't come back yet. It had been 20 years. Telemachus was in his mother's womb when his father left. He's never set eyes on his father. And he's grown up, and he looks a lot like his father, but he doesn't know how to act. He's never had anyone to show him the ropes, as it were. He doesn't know how to behave, and so he's sort of lost. He's got all the suitors around him. He's troubled. He's the son of a famous man, and yet he doesn't know what to do. Now, the Greeks would have recognized this as a terrible state for the young man, Telemachus. He doesn't have an adult and a father to teach him how to act. And that is one of the chief outcomes of education, is to know how to act and how to live. So he lacks a moral example. And so this would be, I say this because he is talking really about education here as well, as his view of human nature. it's talking about this word mimesis, which is imitation. That's the means of education that the classical world will use up until this day. That is Wordsworth's day. We will imitate. Well, what do we mean imitate? We'll imitate the conduct, and we will learn what previous generations learned. We will learn their knowledge for our own. We'll make it a part of ourselves. As much as it's a part of our parents, it will also be a part of ourselves. We're going to learn what they learned. We're going to imitate them. Do what they did. So the Apostle Paul says, imitate me. He actually doesn't just say follow Jesus. He says, imitate my way of conduct. This is how I've acted in your presence. Imitate me as I've done. This is, so it's not just classical, it's biblical. That imitation is the means of education. But now there's a complete reversal of that in this declaration and in this poem. And it's not just in this poem, it's throughout the Romantic movement. The idea that we want to begin from ground zero, from nothing. John Locke talks about the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. We want to begin, and I used this illustration for you in another class as well, that we want to return and think of ourselves as being like orphans, as having no parents. Let's just, as a thought experiment, pretend that we are parents or are orphans and have no parents and have no one to turn to imitate. Let's look for knowledge within ourselves and let's try that one out. That's what Wordsworth is presenting here in his declaration that the child is the father of the man. And then he's going to explore what that looks like, and I'll get to it in a sec, but I'll answer a question before that.
Think, like in the Bible, when Jesus says to me, "Come to me like little children," but in speaking of
Good.
in that terms, it's meaning more like in humility and innocence,
Yes.
and eagerness to
Yes.
learn, which is not though of saying that.
He's saying that they should be like little children and come to him, but he's not saying that he's going to become like a little child and go to them. Note. And note that Jesus doesn't start his teaching ministry when he's an infant. He starts it when he's 30 years of age, when he's ready, which is an extraordinary thing. And the incarnation and the whole doctrine of it is an extraordinary thing. God is born in human flesh, first of all, as an infant, and is raised by his parents. And at what point does he realize that he's God? I mean, if he's the human side of him must not know it. The divine side, like what's going on there, I don't even know. The human mind, the divine mind, that like all we know is from the text, from Scripture, he starts his teaching ministry at the age of 30, knowing who he is and telling people to repent and to place their faith in him. So he knows who he is at that point. At what point does he come to that realization? Did he always know it? I don't know, but we know that he waited till he's 30, and then when the children are to come to him, they are to come to him and they're to be like him. And so, yes, it's meant as humility. It's not meant you have to think like a child and act like a child and invent your own self like a child the way the Romantics are. So you mustn't confuse the two, but you're right, it sounds similar.
So I think to me it speaks of a big part of humility, like having my own child, and I'm sure you have seen too.
Yes.
There's times where even us as adults, your kid will say something or do something, and for the adult to be like humble and be like, wow, okay, I see from your perspective, or that's an interesting way to explore that, and like we can learn from each other, sort of a thing, and even as parents, we can learn from our children.
To some degree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, children, and you'll know this as well, they don't have moral awareness at a certain age. They develop that as they get older. When I say the moral awareness, they know what bad is and what right means and wrong and good. They know what these words mean, but they don't really understand the consequences of actions because they haven't really been able to see them. Right? So they can do things like terrible things, like they can be really cruel to animals, and they don't even necessarily realize what that means exactly. That it takes time for moral awareness to develop, and it's part of the maturation process. So certain things so children can kill. They have the capacity to do it, but they don't have the moral awareness to do it, and we don't judge them as that. There's an age of majority for that reason. Right? And so they're not judged as adults, they're judged as children, because for that reason we recognize that there's a difference in that. So that utterly contradicts the romantic view in one sense. Yes. On the other hand, you can learn from children in the sense that every human being is unique, and sometimes people just look at things differently. And part of what you learn with other people, particularly your family, is a relational thing, because they've learned what a hypocrite you are in a certain area of your life because they've lived with you all the time. So there's that type of thing, and maybe you were blind to that yourself, or who knows what. But usually your kids aren't teaching you things that you've never thought about before, or not really. Anyway, let's go to the poem. It was written in 2 parts, by the way. So he started the poem, the first 4 stanzas he wrote, and then he left it incomplete, and he picked them up later on. And I think you can actually see a sort of a change between the first 4 and the last 5 stanzas. But I'm going to read the first 4 together as a whole, and then I'll make a few comments on it. But remember, it's from Recollections of Early Childhood, and the child is father of the man. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Now, while the birds thus sing a joyous song, and while the lambs bound as to the tabor sound, to me alone there came a thought of grief. A timely utterance gave it relief, and I, that thought relief, and I again am strong. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountains throng. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep, and all the earth is gay. Land and sea give themselves up to jollity, and with the heart of May doth every beast keep holiday. Thou, child of joy, shout round me. Let me hear thy shouts, thou happy shepherd boy. Ye blessed creatures, I have heard the call ye to each other make. I see the heavens laugh with you in your jubilee. My heart is at your festival, my head hath its coronal. The fullness of your bliss I feel it all. O evil day, if I were sullen while earth herself is adorning this sweet May morning, and the children are culling on every side in 1,000 valleys, far and wide fresh flowers, while the sun shines warm and the babe leaps up on his mother's arm. I hear, with joy I hear. But there's a tree, of many, one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? So these famous opening lines, as I say, that he leaves the poem for a while, comes back to it years later to complete it, set the stage for everything that follows, and they really tell the tale of the growth from innocence to experience. Now, I realize that I was forced to drop the Blake, which I regret. But in Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, he talks about 2 sides of human consciousness. The innocence on the one hand and experience on the other, and both in Blake's view are good, by the way. Wordsworth agrees with him on this front. The goodness of innocence is that of a sense of belonging in the world and joy, which you will recall yourselves the first time you saw anything, it's usually a pretty exciting experience. I don't know if you recall going around on your hands and knees looking at ants and anthills, or watching bumblebees go out of flowers, or seeing a rainbow for the first time, or a mountain, or water, and listening to the water, or catching a fish. First time experience of things can be quite vivid, and they're also quite exciting. When you're a child, the days are long. So when you come to a summer holiday, it seems like it goes on a very long time. And as you get older, it gets shorter, which is a funny old thing because the time has not changed, right? The years are just as long. You can chronologically measure them, and they're no different than when you were a child. But it seems like life is getting faster the older you get. And part of the reason for that is what Wordsworth's talking about. There's no new things. Everything is repetition. And with the repetition in his sense is the sense it starts to fade and become indistinct. And it becomes, as he says, it fades into the light of the common day. That's what he said, I believe, at the outset, or does he say that later on? No, he says that at the end of the 5th stanza. So things start to become habitual, routine, and thereby they lose the sense of vividness and the joyfulness, and you lose a sense of the spiritual significance of things. That is what happens when you get older. Yes?
There's another thing along with that idea. It's kind of the proportion of every year. So when you're 5 years old, the 5th year is 20% of your life.
Correct.
When you're 50 years old.
Yep.
The 50th
It's 1/50th.
1/50th.
Yep.
So it's just diminishing returns over time.
To some degree. So that is an aspect of it, and every year was an experience, and you learned something. I mean, you say you learn something new every day, okay. But now that day was what percentage of your life? So it's you're right, in terms of comparison, it is less and less significant as the time goes by. That doesn't mean that you can't have life-changing events as you're older. You can have those events, and they are quite extraordinary, like conversion as an adult. That's quite an extraordinary life-changing event, and it's like a day like no other in a sense. But in general, you're absolutely correct, and what he's describing, though, is what everybody experiences, and he does it quite powerfully in a sense. So that's the opening gambit, is that he sees that back to the first stanza, it is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. So he's not only lost vividness, he's actually can't see things that he once saw. So there's a growing blindness. So he's actually making an antithesis to the normal way in which we would understand learning and becoming an adult. We say it's a growth in knowledge. He presents it as a loss of knowledge, which is an interesting way of looking at it. Counterintuitive in one sense, but if he's describing the importance of those events as a young man or as a child, then it's appropriate. Yes?
Couldn't it also be related to what we were talking about earlier for the awareness of morality for kids growing up, that if the wages of sin are death, that in adolescence your imagination dies because you get a sense of the real world, the good and the bad in application, even though in your mind as a kid you may know, or at least think you know, what bad and good is, but when it comes to the growing into the real world, that's when you have the awareness of morality.
I actually think that children do know what good and bad is, and I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I have read psychological studies that are looking at babies and how they respond to certain situations where injustice is done, and observing the baby's reaction, they actually get incensed. They get red-faced and angry when there's an injustice, and they're obviously reading into it, but it's quite, I mean, babies aren't hypocrites. They haven't learned to act yet, right? They are manifesting their feelings quite vividly and directly, and there's no attempt to conceal them. So they have demonstrated, psychologists, I think, or at least they're making the argument that babies do have an awareness of right and wrong very early on, and that's why they respond to stories of right and wrong, like fairy tales, where there's very strong and to some degree stereotypical or caricatured there's a good guy and a bad guy. There's a prince and there's a witch, right? There's the young, beautiful girl, whether she's a Cinderella or Snow White or whatever, and then you got the wicked stepmother. There's a witch. So there's good figures and they're bad, and they're quite, as I say, pronounced. And these appeal to people. Why do they appeal to them? Because they think that that's the way things really are. They're teaching what the perennial philosophy, which is the fact that there is that there's an objective moral order in the universe, and everybody's aware of it. Now, come this period, and after this period, this idea that there is an objective moral nature to nature, particularly our human nature, it starts to come into dispute. In part because of this shift. But yes, I agree. But let me move on. One other comment here. When Wordsworth finally wrote the poem, he was criticized about it because it seemed to be suggesting certain things about the soul which were heretical. And he was criticized for it. And he said, well, I was just using it as an illustration. So it's Neoplatonism. And that will become apparent in the fifth stanza here, where he talks about the birth of the soul and the doctrine of anamnesis, which is recollection. So let me just write that down here. Anamnesis, which he gets from Plato. And it's part of the title, right? Recollection and the doctrine of anamnesis. Anamnesis is to remember again. That was Plato's theory of knowledge. Everyone knows everything. And education is recalling or remembering what we already know. Whereas Aristotle has a different view of education. He thinks that we learn new things and come into the world with relative ignorance, and we have to be taught things. But Plato holds to the idea that we actually know things already, and we're just, the teacher is simply bringing to mind things that we are already intuitively aware of. And so Wordsworth is throwing himself with the Neoplatonists. But note back to this. Our birth, so this is the fifth stanza, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light, and whence it flows. He sees it in his joy. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. So there's three stages here. He begins in infancy. As he grows, the shades of the prison house close around him. And not only do they close around him, he walks away from it. So there's two sides to it. There's a sense of it's something that happens to him, and it's also something that he brings about. So Wordsworth notes that people long for experience. And they learn through that experience as well, and they desire to imitate. In fact, Aristotle says that it's a feature of mankind that we love to imitate. It's almost a definition. Human beings love to imitate. And they look to models, role models to imitate, which anybody who has children observes, for good and for ill. The good things you like, the bad things you don't like. Oh, I've got that habit. Don't you do that. You're not supposed to do that. I want you to do this, but not do that. And you pick up the worst things and you don't pick up the best things. How is that? Yeah, do as I said. Well, yes, do as I tell you, don't do as I do. And the kid says, oh no, you did that. And hypocrisy. Children are great, clear-sighted about hypocrisy. particularly in their own parents. That's because it's harder to do and see the good than it is to see the bad. It's really easy. You don't have to do any work. The bad comes to you. The good you have to strive after. But this is a process, and it's a change, and it goes, and the light which attended his birth, he presents as a sleep and a forgetting. And it's a process of forgetting. We forget the glory from which we came, and he presents that as God, and he also presents it as nature. And he almost doesn't distinguish the two. Other than he mentions the two. But what is the distinction between God and nature? I'm not sure. And he's not sure either, I would say. This is part of the panentheism. It's a theological problem. I think it's also an intellectual problem. But let's indulge the poet and at least give him the credit that he's describing something which is experientially true in some way. And so as we get older, that light and the vividness and the sense of glory in all things, which we all experience as young people, starts to, as you get older, it dies. It's a sleep and a forgetting. Let me go on. 6th stanza. Earth fills her lap with pleasures of her own. Yearnings she hath in her own natural kind, and even with something of a mother's mind, and no unworthy aim, the homely nurse doth all she can to make her foster child, her inmate, man, forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial palace whence he came. Let me comment on this again. So, Earth is presented in various ways. A mother, a nurse, a foster mother, and a jailer. 4 things. And note there's a progression, and it's progressively distant, progressively more hostile. And the hostility comes, though, in the very act of departing from his essential self. That sense of alienation is one that comes about as a result of growing older. So once again, Earth presents it with something of her own natural kind, and even with something of a mother's mind. And no unworthy aim. The homely nurse. Now the nurse is somebody that will nurse you, will suckle. So a mother will nurse her child. So don't think of a nurse in the sense of the lady that's wearing a white outfit in the hospital. Think of nurse in the sense of giving you nurture. And so she's giving something of herself, something of her essence, her sustenance that she passes on. And she's doing all that she can. Now, as he continues to describe her, note that she becomes increasingly distant and alien and hostile towards him, because it moves then to be her foster child. At first it was her child, and then becomes her foster child, so she's adopted the child. It's not hers. Then it moves on to her inmate, or at least finally it comes to her inmate. So now, what he describes earlier, the shades of the prison house, begin to close. Actually, is it later than this? I think it might be. Or am I thinking of Blake here? But he talks about the shades of the prison house which begin to close around a person as he or she gets older, and does so of his own accord. It doesn't just happen. The child intentionally walks into experience and away from innocence, to use Blake's terminology. Let's present it in a different way. The 7th stanza. Behold, the child among his newborn blisses, a 6 years darling of a pygmy size. See, where mid work of his own hand he lies, fretted by sallies of his mother's kisses. He's rubbing them off. With light upon him from his father's eyes. See, at his feet, some little plan or chart, some fragment from his dream of human life, shaped by himself with newly learned art. A wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral, and this hath now his heart, and unto this he frames his song. Then will he fit his tongue to dialogues of business, love, or strife, But it will not be long ere this be thrown aside, and with new joy and pride the little actor cons another part. To con is to learn another role, filling from time to time his humorous stage, with all the persons down to palsied age that life brings with her in her equipage, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. Now note this in conjunction with what I said here earlier. The child acts as if imitation were his whole vocation, as if that were his nature, to be like an adult. He doesn't deny that that's what children want to do. They want to be like adults. Everyone wants to be big. They want to be treated like adults. They want to do what adults do. They want to do this. He sees that there's something perverse in this. The perversity is they're walking away from that goodness in their nature that they once took joy in it, to the degree that they actually lose it. They lose sight of it entirely. Yes?
How is it that the innocence is sort of being praised as the ideal thing, like the child's innocence, being able to see the world, but yet we're seeing heroes being less innocent versions of these same children, like orphans and criminals and things like that. Like, it's kind of like the innocents have been corrupted, but there's still a child. Like, the
inner child.
Yes. But in a way, isn't that kind of the image that he's giving as unideal? Like, when we learn to, like, there's the jailer, there's the foster mother, there's the, like, which is it? Is it that the...
It's slightly complicated, but the narrative that we're getting here is is a non-Christian rendering of Christian experience. So it's replacing the idea of creation, fall, and redemption. Mm-hmm. How do we account for what Christians call sin? How do we account for that? Romantics won't talk about sin. They'll talk about a sense of loss, a sense of ruin, a sense of desolation, a sense of, rarely of corruption, because that's a moral category, but a sense, they want to avoid that to some degree, but a sense of a loss of primal innocence and goodness, and we walk away from that. So that is what he's describing here is growing old is more or less the account of the fall. So it's not actually doing anything wrong. It's simply growing older is a sort of a fall from who you were originally. So a fall from innocence is simply getting older without doing anything wrong, or unless the wrong is by getting older. But there's going to be a recompense for that, getting older. And we're going to come to that in a second here. But note that he describes this in the quite important terms of as if his whole vocation were endless imitation, and he must have in mind the tradition of mimesis and education and his opposition to that. And he's presenting an alternative to it. Remember, the child is the father of the man. This is a new way of looking at the world. Here's a way to be truly educated. And now he's describing the problem. What is the solution to the problem? He's coming to this right now. Yes?
So would his ideal be someone who has that being of an inner child that has gained all the experience sort of themselves?
You can't avoid the experience. If you live, you will experience. It's not. So again, Blake also talks about these two antitheses, that the songs of innocence, songs of experience. Innocence becomes a child. It attends, when you're a child, you're innocent. You can't harm anything, it's there. If you grow at all, you're going to experience things, and with that comes a change. There's a loss of innocence. These are unavoidable things. What is the recompense for what you've lost? You can imagine the things in the past, and the imagination is better than the real thing. That's consistent throughout the Romantics. So the imagination is the redemptive faculty. It's the means of recovering what's lost, and better than in its original state. Because now you've learned from your own experience. So it's like it's a secular equivalent to Milton's message in Paradise Lost, that the paradise within, happier far. So yes, you've transgressed, you've learned, you've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you have fallen from grace and from the sight of God as a rebel, but you have repented and you've turned back to God and you've prayed and you've received forgiveness, and God has given you new life. And now you will walk in obedience, and that's the paradise within you, happier far. So that's the Milton's presentation of it. By the way, all the Romantics were profoundly influenced by Milton, to the extent they all write epics as well, and I have a course on that, which I offer here, the Romantic epic. But the point here is they offer an attempted equivalent of that, or an analogy for that. So Wordsworth uses the word God here. God's not particularly important in Wordsworth's thinking. It's the imagination which is a divine faculty and basically takes the place of God. So to be truly educated is to be an imaginative being. Remember he described that in Tintern Abbey? He talked about being suspended in body and becoming a living soul. And that with that he could see into the life of things. That's what we talked about last time. So that's the same process is being described. Loss of innocence, which just comes from experience, but then an imaginative recovery of what was lost. And what you imagine is in some ways superior to its original experience, because the original experience is unreflective. Like when you look at a little ant or a butterfly or a flower or whatever, you take delight in it, but you don't think much about it. As an adult, you can take delight in it, and you can think about it and reflect upon it and imagine, and the imagination is better than the real thing. So in the education system that flows out of the Romantic movement, the imagination and new things are more important than the old things. So there's a strong opposition to bookish knowledge and inherited knowledge and authoritative knowledge in favor of the child's own knowledge and the child's own imagination and the child's own experience. That takes its place. And I think we're still living with the consequences of that. But we've inherited the Romantics' view of the world, more or less, because it's such a strong, in some sense, has such strong correlation to Christian views of this. But let me come to the 8. Sorry, we finished off at 7. As if his whole vocation were endless imitation. Now he addresses the child directly, and he does so through an apostrophe, not the punctuation mark, but through a literary device called apostrophe. He speaks to the child as if the child were a god or an angel or some sort of superior being. He says, "Thou, whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity, thou best philosopher, who yet dost keep thy heritage, thou eye among the blind, that deaf and silent readst the eternal deep, haunted forever by the eternal mind. Mighty prophet, seer blessed, on whom those truths do rest which we are toiling all our lives to find. In darkness lost, the darkness of the grave, thou, over whom thy immortality broods like the day, a master or a slave, a presence which is not to be put by, to whom the grave is but a lonely bed without the sense or sight of day or the warm night, a place of thought where we in waiting lie. Thou little child, yet glorious in the might of heaven-born freedom on thy being's height, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost and deep almost as life." So lots of questions here. There's an apostrophe. He speaks to the child directly. In intimate terms, he uses the term thou. And the thou is probably himself, thinking of himself as a child there, imagining himself as a child. Why did you do this? Why exactly did you do this? Why does every child do this? when you had freedom. So by the way, so the imagination, the purpose of the imagination is to recover that sense of unity between ourselves and the natural world. That's the purpose of it. So the origins are with our birth and our early childhood experiences. The fall is in growing older. The means of redemption is the imagination. And the reality of the redemption, the kingdom of God, if you will, is a recovery of our sense of unity that lies between ourselves and all things. The birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees and the water and the air and other people and animals, and there's a unity there. A lack of differentiation. It's the panentheism I talked about there. The spiritual goodness in all things, which we see through the eyes of the imagination. Note there's no sin. There's no cross. There's no God. There's no hell. Although the hell, to some degree, is living a life without the imagination. That's the hell. And furthermore, those that oppose the kingdom of God are those that oppose his view of the imagination. They are the spiritually dead. Those that act in accordance with the world as it was historically underdone. So there's a strong antithesis between Wordsworth and the Romantics and the not just the Enlightenment, but Christianity, which they see as indifferent from the Enlightenment, see them indistinctly. They see it as the same thing. When I say they, there are Romantics among them that come to disagree with them. My favorite, Coleridge, disagrees strongly, but he grows to his disagreement. He starts off on the same page, or at least apparently so. But note, why do you provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, the yoke of bondage? Why do you go into the land of slavery? Note all these images are heavily biblical images as well. He talks about jubilee, he talks about yokes, he talks about, right? These are biblical terms without biblical sense. And soul even. What does he mean by the soul? This is also very interesting. So 130, full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight. What does he mean by the soul? He references Neoplatonism here. He's talking about a thing an immaterial thing inside a body. Well, that's a heretical notion. That's not what the Bible means by soul. The Platonists and the Greeks in general believe that the body is a prison house for the soul. That's the term that they use, actually. That's Plato's term. The body's a prison house. The soul's inside of it. The aim of life is to release the soul from its bodily bondage, and there are various ways of doing that. But all the philosophers regard the soul as the essential self, and it's a non-physical self. And Wordsworth uses it in that same way. And early psychology sees it in the same way. It's an immaterial thing. As I say, nowadays, psychology has changed as a discipline quite markedly and moved towards the idea that the psyche or the soul is the brain, which makes us just material. Our contemporaries who act and operate that way is nothing other than materialists. Yes?
When they're referring to the soul, do you think they're just emphasizing the imagination?
It could be. It's really hard to know what he means by it. And I think you're probably close to the truth here. The soul is the imagination. And it can't be killed off. And to some extent, it's the thing that brings about a recovery. Yes, perhaps so. Yeah. And then when you come to the early psychologists, the early schools of psychology like Freud, he'll talk about the importance of the subconscious in the formation of the conscious self. So the ego and the id and the superego, the stuff do you do Freud in psychology anymore? Even? No, okay. I mean, there aren't many Freudian psychologists anymore. It's become a little unpopular, but the origins of it are that, and they're accounting for how do we explain how people act in a way that is contrary to their best interests. the superego being society, the id being, I guess, your desires, your sin, but they don't call it that, but your desires, and then your ego, yourself, which is formed by this interplay between those two. But there's something beneath your desires which you don't want to be expressed, and yet they keep popping up. Again, trying to find rationale to explain human behavior. I don't think the brain solution is any better. I think it's 10 times worse, actually. I just think it's irrational and totally unhelpful. Why do they write papers to demonstrate it? If we are just material things, why would you do that? Why would I read it? Am I trying to persuade somebody? Why would you need to persuade them if they were just brains? If that was what you were talking to, is another brain, a brain talking to the brain, and the brain's purposes are irrational, they're sub-rational at any rate. Just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, but they move along this, and note that their blessedness of the soul is going into strife or conflict by learning imitation. Okay, now let's come to the 9th stanza, which is the key stanza. Yes?
Do they only don't talk about the soul compared to the spirit? Because those are two separate things.
Are they?
In what I learned, yes.
Where did you learn that? I'm not saying you're wrong, by the way.
In my church.
In your church, okay. There's a dispute in Christian circles on that, actually. Is the human person bipartite or tripartite? Is it body, soul, and spirit, in other words? Because some have said that, and that's a position in the early church even. One of the church fathers, and I can't remember who it was exactly, holds to that position. The Bible is a little bit unclear exactly on it, and I don't think there's a standard Christian position on that particular thing. I mean, it speaks of soul, it speaks of spirit, and it speaks of them distinctly, so it lends to the view that there is that. But I don't think there's a full-blown anthropology on that, per se. And it's used differently by different biblical writers, for the most part.
When they were talking about it in the Romantics and that, they only refer to soul.
Well, no, Wordsworth's using his soul here. I don't think Romantics in general will talk about the soul necessarily. But if and when they do, it probably has something of the character of the imagination, or at any rate of something disembodied. And that is good, because the imagination is the vehicle of goodness, because it's the thing that imagines things. It creates new things, and by their view of creativity is absolute. They're creating things out of nothing, literally. They are acting like gods. The poets believe that they are in the great prophetic tradition of English poetry, except far greater than that, because they are literally imagining new things. Remember, they appeal to originality, which nobody before them would ever even consider doing. Not just because it's blasphemous, because it doesn't really seem to make much sense. Even back in times of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Anyway, we go to the 9th chapter. Oh joy, says Wordsworth. So having ended on this dark note that the soul is rushing into a dark and cold and deathly state, it's not totally gone. Oh joy, he writes, that in our embers, the embers of the fire that's gone out, is something that doth live. That nature yet remembers what was so fugitive. The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction. Not indeed for that which is most worthy to be blessed, delight and liberty, the simple creed of childhood, whether busy or at rest, with new-fledged hope still fluttering in his breast. Not for these I raise the song of thanks and praise, but for those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized. High instincts before which our mortal nature did tremble like a guilty thing surprised. But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections which, be they what they may, are yet the fountain light of all our day, are yet a master light of all our seeing. Uphold us, cherish, and have power to make our noisy years seem moments in the being of the eternal silence. Truths that wake to perish never, which neither listlessness nor mad endeavor nor man nor boy nor all that is at enmity with joy can utterly abolish or destroy. Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither and see the children sport upon the shore and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. So here's the recovery of the innocence. It's through the imagination. There's something that lives in us in the midst of the... Now, if you think about the embers of a fire, when the fire's gone low, you can't even see that there are embers there, unless you blow on it, in which case they light up. Right? But there's a darkness, and it's so dark that it seems the fire has gone out, and yet the heat remains there, and something in it is there to be revived. And how is it revived? Through thinking of the past, recollecting, remembering who we are, which we've forgotten by our actions, our conduct, our life of imitation, our growing old. And the thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction. Now, a benediction is a word for blessing, to say good, to say well. It's what happens at the end of a church service. There's a benediction, a blessing on the congregation as they go. Here it's the thought of his past years when he was a child. That brings him to benediction. Not for that which is most worthy to be blessed, but for the loss, those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings. That's what he gives thanks for. The sense of having lost something, the senses, and gained, and this is elliptical, the imagination that takes its place. So I remember in the past things that I lost, but the fact that they are things that I've lost have made me aware that there's something that I haven't lost. And what is that? My imagination. So yes, I've lost that, but now I've recovered it. How have I recovered it? By thinking about it, imagining, remembering it. Yeah. Yes, but that's it. And to live in the light of that imagined sense of oneself as a child, connected to all things, allows you as an adult to imagine what it's like to be another person, putting yourselves in their place, recognizing the primal unity between all human beings, and not only all human beings, but all things. So it's the kingdom of God which is within you. Is that what Jesus means? Because it sounds a bit like it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the kingdom of God is within you. Oh, so it's an imaginary world that I live in? You might think so. I'm not saying based on what you read in Scripture. I'm saying based on how Wordsworth is rendering it. You could think that he's talking about the same thing. And he says that he is, actually. Because this is what Jesus really meant. This is the Holy Spirit. Jesus talked about the Holy Spirit with an H. We can do better than that. We can talk about the Holy Spirit. It's entirely spirit. We can see spiritually. We think spiritually. It's called spirituality. Very common in our day. Applies to everything. Includes everything. Of course it includes everything. This is inclusivity. This is the doctrine of inclusivity right here in its early origins. It's not just saying that things are one, it's saying that it's right that we see them as one, and it's wrong if we see differentiation. if we see distinctions, this is the beginning of our whole contemporary way of looking at things. And it is at odds with the Christian faith, I would say, and with the kingdom of God that Jesus announces, and with, I think, a true view of human nature and the human condition. Yes?
So would you say his poems and like the things that he like writes is like not the beginning of spirituality, but like definitely promotes it a lot? Or?
I think he's the best writer, one of the best writers in the English language, and I think it's almost pure heresy.
Okay. So would you say spirituality is like it starts more with him, or like
There is such a thing as biblical spirituality, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't want to avoid the idea of spirituality in one sense, but on the other hand, I'm wary of it just because spirituality means almost invariably a sense of the unity and connection and love of all things. Without distinction, and no, in this, what goes with it is there's no real sense of evil in the world. Evil is simply growing old. Well, that's not evil. I don't regard that as evil. But he does. It's an evil. It's a loss of something fundamental. Well, that is an evil. Well, how about genuinely appalling actions then? He's not talking about murder. He's just talking about growing old. But it's as if something got killed off, the most important thing. Well, his sense of himself. It is a theological claim, really. I don't think it bears weight. It doesn't account for the world as I have experienced it. The misery in the world. I think it's entirely too sanguine about human nature. It promotes, by the way, a Pelagian view of human nature. I should also say, if you want, I said heretical. Let's name it the heresy as it is. It's Pelagianism. You can look that up. Pelagian view, or Pelagianism if you want, after the British monk Pelagius. It opposes the doctrine of original sin. It thinks sin is something that happens to us, not something that we bear by virtue of the fact that we are the heirs of Adam and Eve. So sin, according to Pelagius, is something that we do, but it doesn't mark who we are. And Wordsworth agrees with that. Not intentionally, or at least I don't know his intentions, but on the face of it here. Now again, he's a poet, so you don't want to take him too seriously. I've taken him perhaps more seriously than he deserved, just because I want you to see where this goes. I mean, I think it's a beautiful poem. It's certainly powerful. I remember when I first read it as an undergraduate, being moved by it. Something is right about this. But also, the more I thought about being disturbed by it, if this is true, then what does this mean for evil? And if inclusion is wonderful, which it seems like it is, how do we have any justice then? Right? If everyone's included and everything is included, irrespective of its particular nature, then that seems problematic to me. So evil is something that happens, and it's not how we begin, though. We begin and Wordsworth says we are essentially good, which is to some degree a Christian view, except the essential goodness was lost in Eden when Adam and Eve rebelled against God. That's when that original goodness was lost. But it's still true of human nature that we bear the image of God. That is true. So, and that image has not been lost, it's simply been marred. So I talked about this when I did Paradise Lost. The theology of this is it's important. We cannot lose the image of God. Even in the fall, we remain sinners. But a sinner is simply a rebel against God that bears God's image. And therefore in Genesis 9, verse 3 or 4, I believe it is, God says that you may not murder. And if anyone takes the life of one who bears the image of God, be a life for a life. Right? Because that, and the explicit reason is because he bears the image of God. And these are sinners. So we still bear the image of God, but the image of God has been marred by our sin. It's corrupted. But if we didn't bear the image of God, we wouldn't be human beings at all. So there's something there that bears the image of God, but it needs to be redeemed. But Wordsworth says that there's an essential goodness, and we walk away towards evil. Now here's the question: if we're essentially good, then why do we invariably do this? Because he says that we do this. It's not just that it happens, it invariably happens. They desire it. Well, why would a good thing want to do an evil thing? It makes no sense to me. It never made any sense to me. And it has to make sense. Like the Christian doctrine, whatever you make of it, it makes sense at least. This makes no sense. Something that is essentially good will not gravitate towards what he calls evil. Doesn't make any sense. He's not serious of what he means by evil then, which is one of the other effects of this view. So the effect of Pelagian theology is to diminish what evil is and to be unrealistic and thereby to be cruel and unjust. Yes?
If that were true, then if man were entirely good and essentially good, then the natural world would then have to be evil in order
It would have to be.
corrupt it. But that's definitely not his
That's
position.
definitely not his position. So there is no real evil. And furthermore, the solution to this problem of evil would be a sociological problem. You'd have to encourage everybody to be imaginative. That would be the solution to the problem. You just have to think the right way. So we can coerce you. You just have to hold the right theological views. You don't have to really be born again, thinking the right things and feeling the right things. That's how you will demonstrate. Well, you can coerce people to doing that. Well, what happens to freedom then? It also goes. So does God, by the way. God he's referred to here. It's not, I don't think you can take him seriously. In fact, people who are not Christians, who are romantics who read this, are offended by Wordsworth's reference to God, and I think rightly so. Yes?
Who's his directed audience?
His intended audience? Well, his contemporaries. But I will say that Wordsworth and Coleridge, because we're coming to an end here, Wordsworth and Coleridge Wordsworth in particular was so profoundly influential, particularly amongst the young. They thought there's something spiritually correct here about what he's saying. That it was a phenomenon. And particularly the young were aware that he was so, if you think about context, this is an age when science is describing people as walking machines. There's a mechanistic view of human nature. And Wordsworth's saying, no, there's a spiritual aspect to us which transcends that. And the young said, yes, that's right. And I think he is right in that sense. The question is, what's the nature of the spiritual nature in us? And on that, I think he's wrong. But he was really influential in his day. And within the church, he was received very well precisely because he awakened a sense of our spiritual nature in a next generation. And the dangers in his position, I think, he had his critics right away, but the dangers were not clearly evident, and they never did become clearly evident. To this day, I think Romanticism remains the default theological position of the liberal non-Christian world. Romanticism is it. I didn't even get to 10 and 11, but then the end of it is just a nature singing and birds singing and everyone, because of this wonderful news and so forth. So I'll leave that to you. So let me leave it off with that.